Welcome to the Holos project. It is fascinating to look at our topic today, which is water. From stock to flow is the theme that Dr. Turton is going to be discussing with us. Seeing it not as a substance, but as an action, as a flow. Now, Dr. Turton is well qualified to talk on this topic. He has been he's professor at the Center for Environmental Studies at the University of the Orange Free State. He's been the former deputy governor of the World Water Council and is currently editor of their formal journal, Water Policy. He's spoken on this topic deeply, and in our brief conversations that we've already had, I sensed that here is somebody that really gets the notion and understanding of what the holistic perspective is about. And so it is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Turton to us, to also wish Dr. Turton happy birthday. It's his birthday today. And as you shared with us, Tony, you also had your jab today, so good strength with the effects of your COVID jab. Some of the folks that have had it, I believe, had quite a rough time. And we're really looking forward to the next half hour, your presentation. And then after that, we're going to break into chat rooms that will be managed by Nick, our very competent facilitator. And we will be addressing certain questions that I'll share with you so we can internalize the information, articulate it in our own way. And then after we've had that conversation in groups of about 6, we will reconvene and we will then have a discussion with a closing discussion with Dr. Turton. So without further ado from me, Dr. Turton, welcome and over to you.
Good day to you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to address you here today. And I've got one small correction. Just now I said I recognize Martin Ginster from SA Breweries, actually from Sasol. My apologies. I confused him with another colleague from SA Breweries. It happens when you get to be 67 years of age. When Claudius asked me to talk about this subject, I immediately became interested because while I'm not an expert on holism, I've always been deeply, profoundly conscious of the fact that there's something out there that I don't understand, and there's a whole lot more to it than I am capable of grasping. So what I've learned how to do is I'm a 12th generation African, and those of you that know me will know my standard shtick that I give. I'm going to give it now. I'm a 12th generation African. My oldest relative that came to South Africa in 1652 with a gentleman by the name of Jan van Riebeck, happened to be a refugee from the 30 Years' War in Europe. And so I'm the product of refugee flows, flows of people over international borders, pushed and pulled by various phenomena. And my second generation, after the first generation of trauma, found my great 10th great grandparent here in South Africa. The next generation with the French Huguenots, people escaping the Edict of Nantes and all of the intolerances of religious persecution, etc. So I'm originally partially German and mostly French, believe it or not, and that's what I am. But I consider myself to be an African. And as an African, I've learned a couple of things, and I've learned in particular the art of storytelling. I am the custodian of my family's history. I'm the custodian of my family's knowledge, and that's you'll see that on the screen. I've got a name, a Zulu name. My Zulu name is Kaoleza, and Kaoleza means to always be in a hurry, always be in a rush. And my brother's name is Machamela, which means to the one that stands and watches and never speaks. But my father's name, and this is where it's significant, his name was Bodwe. And that refers to the reeds on the side of a river, on the banks of a river. And those reeds once a year throw up a plume of seed. And that plume of seed gets caressed by the wind and it dances around. And the word Bodwe refers to the one that stands above, but is part of a greater whole. So I learned about this at the age of 5. when I was given my traditional Zulu name, because a traditional name is a name that you cannot give yourself. It is a name that the village elders, that the tribal elders give you. They look at you and they observe you and they find a quality in you and they name you. So that's your given name. And that's the significant part of it, because the name Umqangabodwe, the one that stands above, but is part of a greater whole, unbeknownst to me, was infused into my knowledge of the universe, my knowledge of everything that I know, such as it is. I might be misguided, but that's what it was. So my father was a hunter. He was a typical African man of that era. He was a hunter, and he would think nothing of taking me out of school at a very young age. And I spent many many months and months of my life on the plains of the Kalahari, witnessing the flow of water from the Okavango River, one of the last pristine rivers of the world, one of the last undammed, free-flowing rivers in the world. And sitting there around the campfire at night, I started to ponder. I was 5 years of age, and I started to ponder a couple of things that I'll share with you tonight. And what I pondered on was the notion of significance and the notion of relevance. And this is very important, this notion of significance and the notion of relevance. And sitting around the campfire with my face warmed by the flames, my back cold to the cold night air of the desert. The Kalahari is a great big desert. If anyone, if you don't know what it is, it's a massive desert in central southern Africa. And it's ancient. It's an ancient piece of geology. But this desert it's rich in life, and it's, of course, because it's a desert, it's unpolluted, and it's the night skies are absolutely vast. And I used to lie in my back in my sleeping bag, listening to the hyenas laughing in the distance, and listening to the lions growl and roar, and listening to all of the night noises of Africa. And I felt enormously and utterly insignificant as an individual. And I felt as significant as one of the wildebeest that roams across the plains, that's driven by thirst, driven by, on the one hand, pushed out of a place because they're thirsty, on the other hand, driven by the allure of something green, something moist that they can now go eat and drink and replenish their thirst and continue their life cycle. And on the way, of course, they meet hardship. They cross rivers and crocodiles eat them and lions take them. But I felt I was as significant as a wildebeest. But in that notion of significance, I was 5 years of age and I was thinking about these fairly deep things. I started to realize with the traditional wisdom that my father gave to me, the one that stands above, but as part of a greater whole, I started realizing that while I might be insignificant, I'm not irrelevant. My relevance is derived from being part of a greater whole. So that, for me, infused in my sort of thinking, firstly, an enormous, insatiable inquisitiveness about how things work, about how the universe functions and what's out there, and what can I learn. I've always been enormously inquisitive. I've never stopped being inquisitive and stopped learning. But it also inspired in me the power of observation. And part of the observation was that I observed the flow of water through a desert. And I started thinking about what that means. And I started understanding that water is a flow that moves through time and space. And depending on where you, the individual, intersect with that flow of water, all sorts of things happen. For example, it was around early settlements where people were settling around water. They might have had a successful hunt when they could now feed themselves properly, and they looked up at the heavens and they started contemplating their own mortality, and they started thinking about, is there a God? Is there a spirit? What is the meaning of life? Is there something bigger than me? So it's a primordial thing. It's a primordial instinct that I was experiencing at the age of 5. But part of that inquisitiveness was to understand that things are restless, things move. And if the hyena takes you, or if the lion takes you, well, so be it. That's just life on the plains of Africa. But it's part of a greater whole, part of a bigger meaning. So so that is something that influenced me very, very greatly. And I typically start off a talk when I'm giving a talk with the following statement. I talk about floating in the lifeless infinity of outer space is one blue planet, the only planet known in the entire universe that's got water in solid, liquid, and vapor form. The only planet that has got biological life that we know it. And 2/3 of that planet are water. 1/3 of it is earth. And human beings, Homo sapiens, in our wisdom, have chosen to cause the only planet in the entire known universe that's covered with water, we've chosen to call it Earth. And there's something profound in that statement, because Homo sapiens, wise man, I've started to think deeper about what it means to be wise. What is wisdom? And I looked at my father, who was a traditional man, father who did not have a university education, was unable to go through formal school. His father, my grandfather, was a squatter, what you would call a squatter. He was a refugee from the Anglo-Boer War. Grew up as a refugee, grew up with absolutely nothing, squatted on someone else's land as a tenant farmer, lived in abject poverty. So my father was unable to go to school in the formal sense of the word, and yet he was an enormously wise man, very wise about the ways of the world, and particularly wise about Africa and the hunt, and the spirituality of the hunt, and the ethics and the protocol of what it means to hunt, and what it means to take a life, and what it means that one life can sustain another, and that whole sort of thing. So we're looking for the bigger meaning of life, and in the process of this, I started to realize a couple of important things, and inside my heart, I had a deep, profound restlessness. And on the one hand, I was driven by this desire to learn and to understand my difference between relevance and significance. But I also wanted to understand how things worked. And I happened to grow up in an age, I think I refer to it nowadays as the era of excellence that I happened to grow up in. And it's a wonderful age. I'm very grateful. I'm a baby boomer, post-World War II baby boomer. And as a small child, I remember a couple of very important events that happened to me. And the one important event was the Apollo mission to the moon. It was a profound moment in my life. As a small boy, I sat in the Kalahari looking up at the night sky with a pair of binoculars, looking at the moon and thinking that humans are going to walk there, and just being absolutely, utterly amazed at that. I was in awe of what human ingenuity can do. But there was another event that also struck me very, very profoundly, and that was a man called Christian Barnard, Dr. Chris Barnard. We chose to question a very important thing. Up until Barnard became a medical doctor, all human life was determined by the number of beats in your heart. And when the heart stopped beating, your life came to an end. And Chris Barnard dared to be different. He dared to say that a human life need not be determined by the number of beats in your heart. We can extend that human life. So here on the one hand, we had NASA going boldly where no man had gone before, and that's not a pun on words. On the other hand, we had Chris Barnard, cutting out human hearts and daring to think differently. And these two events played a profound role in my life. And I became absolutely enamored, and I fell absolutely in love with this whole idea of science and technology and engineering, and asking the right questions. So this insatiable desire of mine, growing up in a family where my father was not a formally educated man, but a man of profound insight into bigger things. And I wrote a paper at one stage on one of my first academic works on the Okavango and the Kalahari. Paper was called Sea of Sand and Land of Water, and it was all about the strategic drivers of what happens, how the flow of water in this desert, in this great lost untapped, or I don't want to call it a resource, this last wonder of nature. And while I was growing up, I always had a deep sense that somewhere along the line, the people that were teaching me were limited in what they were teaching me. And I always had a sense that somewhere I was being cheated by my teachers. And I've subsequently come to know that my teachers were all trained in Newtonian physics. They were trained in the notion of reductionism, where you take a complex whole and you reduce it to simple things, relationship between two variables, and that's how you understand the world. And I always, while I was fascinated and excited by that, I always got a sense, like it's like when you're eating Rice Krispies or one of these breakfast cereals, you always have a sense at the end of the day that there's still something missing. There's a missing ingredient in the meal. You want something more than just the hollow crunch of the snap, crackle, and pop of the nice Rice Krispie. And I was just driven by this to a profound degree. And then I met a young student, a PhD student at Cambridge University, when I was doing my PhD in London. And I had a very, very interesting time while doing that, because the student exposed me to philosophy. And I'd always been a bit of a philosopher by nature, by inclination, but I wasn't really formally trained. And this individual from Canada, Canadian woman, she was doing her PhD on we serve and protect, the whole ethos of the police in the United States of America. And she introduced me to the work of a philosopher named Renee Descartes. And what I found particularly useful about Renee Descartes, who became the foundational thinker of modern reductionism and modern engineering, is about becoming master and owner of nature. So Renee Descartes wrote about becoming, I observed these things, in other words, observable sciences, and I observed that wind and fire and air and all of these big things. And ultimately, he observed that he could control them and he could become a master and owner of nature. So the idea of becoming master and owner of nature somehow fitted into my growing awareness as a misfit, almost like a misguided, a bit of malware in our thinking, that we as Homo sapien, wise man, were supposed to be so wise that we were now becoming master and owner of nature without actually understanding the profound complexity that underpins the processes that are underway in the natural world. But in our arrogance, in our profound arrogance, we actually also have an incredible ignorance about the complexity of these things. What makes the wildebeest run? What makes the wildebeest walk? What is the push factor? What is the pull factor? How does the elephant enable itself to navigate hundreds of kilometers north to south across the landscape of Namibia, the Namib Desert, knowing that 40 years ago, the matriarch remembered a river somewhere over there that in times of great drought, she was prepared to take the entire herd through this desert, knowing that there will be water. How is this knowledge? And the work I'm doing now, I'm a whale watcher. I live next to the ocean overlooking a bay full of whales, and I'm trying to understand whales, etc. now as well. But nonetheless, in this process, I had this sense of unease, the sense that I'd been shortchanged, and I was confronted by this very important decision that I had to make in my life early on. And this decision was, am I going to become a panda bear that can only survive on the bamboo shoot of a specific species of bamboo available only in a diminishing area of bamboo forest on the planet, and therefore an endangered species? Or am I going to become a hyena that will survive anywhere, from a city to the desert, from the thick bush to the, you name it, the hyena will be there. So the hyena is the omnivore, and they can eat anything and survive on anything and scavenge anything. And I chose consciously at a young age that I'm going to become the intellectual hyena. I'm going to become the intellectual omnivore. I'm going to learn about geology but not be a geologist, and learn about chemistry but not be a chemist, and learn about physics and not be a physicist, but know enough about all of them to ultimately talk sense to each of them, and understand that, that when I need to know more about one of those subjects, I'm simply going to employ a specialist and pay them a good salary, and they're going to tell me what I need to know to solve that particular problem. That's what I did as this omnivore, as this hyena. But nonetheless, I'm going to tell you another story now, because through my life, I've adopted a number of mentors, people that I've approached, or people that I've just sometimes appointed as my mentor without them even knowing it. One of them was a very famous sportsman named Gary Player, who taught me that the harder I try, the luckier I get. But another one was an incredible woman, a scientist named Marlin Falkenwock, Professor Marlin Falkenwock. And Marlin Falkenwock played a profound role in my life, because Marlin Falkenwock, a young Swedish woman scientist in the 1970s, when it was becoming fashionable, the World Summit on Sustainable Development was starting to get underway. And she was one of the original participants in the first World Summit on Sustainable Development. And she happened to ask a question that no one else had thought of asking. That is there a finite limit to the number of people that can survive off a given unit of water? And she did the first global empirical study on what we can think about now as a carrying capacity of water. And she came to the startling conclusion that anything beyond 2,000 people per flow, she called a flow unit as a million cubic meters of water per a million liters of water per person per annum. She defined this barrier, which she called water scarcity, and this has now become part of the major global dialogue on water scarcity and particular water footprinting. But nonetheless, Marlin played a profound role in my life, and I developed a very good relationship with Marlin. I started working closely with her, and she really impacted me very severely. When I was a fellow at the Council for Scientific Industrial Research in South Africa, I invited Marlin out as one of my guests, and she played a very big role in a book that we put out on governance, the notion of governance as a trialogue. And Marlin was very, very significant in that. But one day, cut a long story short, I get an email out of the blue from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences now sends me an invitation to come along to be one of the guests at the Lifetime Achievement Award of Professor Marlin Falkenwock. I'm very, very humbled by this invitation, and I get on the airplane and I go there. And I'm sitting in the motor car now. We've been driven from our hotel to this esteemed place, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And I speak a little bit of French, very proud of my little bit of broken French. And sitting next to me was a Frenchman who I had never met before. Nonetheless, I sort of introduced myself enthusiastically in my best French. And I asked him what he does. And well, he's a geophysicist. And I said to him, by the way, so what do you do as a geophysicist? And he told me that he's working on sediments in rivers, river sediments. I said, oh, well, so what? And I'm trying to pull teeth out of a chicken now. So what is it on sediments that you're working on? And he said, no, he's working on radionuclide and heavy metal presence in sediments of rivers. And I said, so what about that? Because now I was very interested. At that stage, I was working in the mining industry on the whole problem of acid mine drainage. The post-mining era was starting to dawn in South Africa, and our limited water resource was now being polluted by acidic mine water on a vast scale. And of course, one of the things in acidic mine water is uranium. So Johannesburg today is the most uranium-contaminated city in the world. And this worried me profoundly, because no one really seemed to think that this was an issue, except myself and one or two others. And nonetheless, when this French scientist announced that he was working on radionuclide activities, I said, so what are you finding? And he said that, well, he's finding that in the sediments of rivers all over the world today, he's finding radionuclides and heavy metals at least 1 or 2 orders of magnitude above background levels. And that to me was almost like an epiphany. That was the most epiphanous moment in my life, because suddenly I realized that what this man was telling me is what I'd been observing my entire life. I'd been observing in the mining industry heavy metals and radionuclides at least 1 or 2 orders of magnitude above background radiation, about background levels, and I'd seen that. And I also, for the first time in my life, realized that unanswered question of mine about the siloed knowledge of reductionist physics, of reductionist thinking, was a profound limiting factor. I always knew that instinctively without knowing what the answer was. And suddenly there, I asked him a question. So firstly, what does this mean? And then he said, oh no, we are now living in a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. This is a new geological epoch in which human behavior, human activities are impacting on the very formation of the geology of the planet. And I thought, wow, this is like profound. This is really, really profound. And it just sort of took me into that space. And I was absolutely blown away. And then I said to him, oh, but by the way, is there a date to this? And he said, yes, about 1943, let's call it 1945. Before 1943-45, there was no heavy metals and no radionuclides. After 43 to 45, suddenly we start getting this the signature coming through. And I was acutely aware that in geology, one of the ways that you date rocks is, in fact, in radionuclides, and particularly iridium in a layer that is associated with one of the major geological transitions in historic time. And that is when the dinosaur mass extinction event took place 65 million years ago. And that's a way of dating the rock. And suddenly now it struck me that in 1943 to 1945, we now have another layer in the rocks of the future, the sediment that's going to become the rocks of the future. And that is what we've made, because that's when we learned to split the atom. And that brought another strand of my life together. And that is a strand of my life that I had the privilege when South Africa was living in isolation as a pariah state. And we were starting to come out of isolation, and I had a little role to play in that, which I won't talk about now. But I was very, very privileged to meet a gentleman called Dr. Joe Rotblat from the Pugwash movement. And Joe approached me, and in fact, he recruited me into the Pugwash movement because there were no South Africans in the Pugwash movement. And he said, oh, we need some South Africans. And so he approached me, he said, will you become one of us? I said, only a pleasure. Thank you very much. And I went to my first Pugwash meeting, and there I was exposed to the Einstein-Russell Manifesto, which is really nothing more about good science must have a social conscience. And suddenly all of these strands came together. They all came together, and I started realizing it was almost like an epiphanous moment in my life. I realized that everything that I've been taught up until now was in fact incomplete. You cannot understand complexity by simplifying it down to two variables. You have to go the opposite direction. We are now living in a new geological epoch, and that new geological epoch is defined by human ingenuity and our ability to split the atom, our ability to create such profound impact on the planet that we are rapidly outstripping the capacity of the planet to sustain human life as we know it. And I was very concerned because I looked around me and I didn't see too many people that were concerned about the problem. And most of my friends are just not at all concerned about this. And in fact, they go in the opposite direction. If you express any concern, they laugh at you because you are some kind of freak of nature. So that's what all happened to me, and I sort of came to this wonderful conclusion that you've got to understand complexity by creating this transdisciplinary skill set, which we don't have. It's a highly scarce skill set. There are very, very few true transdisciplinarians that can work across disciplines. Very few of them, and I've tried my hardest to try and emulate that, to try and be one of those if I can. And ultimately, I've decided that I shall continue to challenge conventional wisdom. And one of the tricks that I play now when I give a talk in an international conference is, especially if I'm talking to scientists or engineers, I ask a very provocative question, and that's the nub of what my presentation's about tonight. And that question is that when we when we brushed our teeth this morning, the water you used to clean your mouth out went through a dinosaur kidney 65 million years ago. That is a fact. And of course, everybody talks about this water scarcity and this water crisis. And I say, no, we don't have a water scarcity. We don't have a water crisis. We have a crisis in critical thinking. That is our crisis. Our planet is 2/3 water. We don't have a water shortage. We have a shortage of critical thinking, and we have an abundance of salt and pollution. That's our problem. We actually are living in a water-abundant planet. Everything that lives is defined by water. When NASA sends a space probe out to another planet, they look for water to try and see if they can find biological life, and they're finding it. They're finding it in our own solar system. So there's water out there, so in all probability there is some form of biological life. So we are not alone. We might be accompanied by microbes or bacteria, but we are not alone. So this whole idea of challenging conventional wisdom, this is why I'm fascinated by talking to a group of people like yourself, because I sense in you kind of kindred spirit, if you like. And I think it's pioneering people like yourself that we need to fire up, to go out there to bring about the fundamental behavioral change we need to start living within our means. Water is an economic enabler. Without water, we have nothing. Wherever you find water, you find all kinds of social activity, you find arts, you find science, you find festivals, you find relative abundance, relative happiness. Water is really an important part of everything that we understand on this planet, everything that's good and wholesome. But water, in fact, is not scarce. It is an infinitely renewable resource. The whole thing that is needed now is we've got to create, let's use the ugly word, the business model. We've got to create a business model that can attract capital and technology. We've got an infinite amount of capital, infinite amount of technology. There's no shortage of either, but there's a shortage in this space right now in this time. So how do we create that enabling environment for capital and technology to do for us what the Okavango Delta has been doing for the elephants for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, okay? Recycling water as an infinite flow, not as a single-use flux. So the notion of water as a stock going through a linear economy that starts off with something of economic value that you reduce that economic value over time, and you convert good quality water into waste to now become a cost or a problem that you've got to dispose of. That's actually the wrong thinking. We've got to start thinking about this more circular kind of economy. We've got to stop being masters and owners of nature, and we've got to start rather thinking about how we can engineer future systems in partnership with nature. So that to me is the sort of big thing, from a linear to a circular economy, from master and owner of nature to partnering with nature, and to start getting those new technologies, the new thinking that comes out of the world, into viable space. And I'm very, very proud to say one of my colleagues is on the list of people watching here today, and with that gentleman, a former United States Marine Corps officer. And we are working in the Middle East at the moment, and we are busy setting up a space in the Middle East where we are creating literally an accelerator, a place where we can invite young people with bright, smart ideas, new inventors, etc. We introduce them to capital funders, people that are willing to put capital into the space, to venture capital, startups, etc. But the whole idea is to change the thinking of water as a stock to water as a flux, and to do it in a petroleum-based economy that recognizes that it's come to the limit of its natural extractive life. As a sovereign state, as an economy, it can only survive by transition to that circular economy. So that's pretty much what I've had. I'm on brief budget and time, as any good professional would be, and I'm going to just say that I think we must never be afraid of asking these awkward questions. When I get up in front of an audience of professors of physics and chemistry, and I ask them, if the mass balance of water has changed on the planet in their lifetime, no, it hasn't. Has it changed in the last millennium? No, it hasn't. Has it changed in the last, whatever? No, it hasn't. The mass balance is pretty much what it always has been. The water moves in time and space. It's an infinitely renewable resource. There's actually a joyous message in that, because we are not constrained by water. We are only constrained by our own thinking about water. And that's my closing statement. Thank you very much. Back to you. Whoever I hand back to.
Thank you very much. That I must say, I could have listened for quite a while longer. Thank you so much for that.
I'm following your brief. You said half an hour, and I gave you half an hour.
Exactly, and thank you for following that brief. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to break up into chat rooms, and we are going to internalize what you've shared with us. And the question that we want you to discuss, whatever you want to discuss, you can discuss in your chat room. But the question is this: first, just get in touch with water. just share some deep experience of water, firstly. Secondly, just share with your colleagues in the chat room what particular element of Dr. Turton's presentation spoke to you. What is it that has remained with you? Thirdly, how does it change your practice and attitude, your usage of water? And then fourthly, as a group, formulate a question that you want to put to Dr. Turton when we come back in a plenary session. Now, I'm aware that there's some really interesting comments in the chat box, and so we'll take a look at those as well when we have our plenary. So I'm just going to run through those again. Share an experience that was profound for you of water. Secondly, ask yourself what was significant in Dr. Turton's presentation. Thirdly, how does that affect your attitude and use of water? And fourthly, together, what is a question that you would like to put to Dr. Turton? One question from the group. So you'll have a good opportunity to discuss that. So we're going to give sufficient time for that. We're going to give 25 minutes. So Nick, our technical expert, will manage that process. So everybody has an opportunity. But in your groups, please give everybody a chance to share their thoughts, so that everybody's had a chance to articulate what is happening for them. And then we'll come back and we'll learn some more. And Dr. Turton, we're going to invite you into one of the chat rooms, and what you can do there, just observe the quality of conversation and put in your further penny, but not to save your wisdom for the plenary session when we come back.
Thank you. I'll go off camera then until you invite me back in again.
Okay, so you'll be invited into your chat room in the next short time.
Thank
so
you.
We'll see you back in 25 minutes time, and enjoy the conversation. So where we're going to go now is we're going to have somebody from each group put a question from that group to Dr. Turton. And I think the easiest way to do that then would just be go to group 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And so I'm going to, having been part of group 1, I think we'll just kick off. And Lou, you're the man that's going to phrase the question.
Yes, and I jumped out of that group. I hit the button a bit quickly there, so I'm going to emphasize the one side of the question we had there. So Tony, you know, we know about the transition that's happening in the world from hydrocarbons to renewables at different speeds in different parts of the world. And then sort of closely followed by that is a transition from linear to circular water management. And a place like Singapore is sort of a world leader in that, and a lot of the rest of the world is way behind. The main resistance to transitioning from hydrocarbons to renewables is one of the big things that causes resistance is the economic investments that people have in the hydrocarbons economy. What do you think is the main resistance, or will be the main resistance, to transitioning from linear to circular water?
Okay, right. What I found very interesting, Lou, is you mentioned the word transitioning from a hydrocarbon economy. So we were talking earlier on about this oxygen thing, but there's another important thing about it, is it's actually carbon and water, H2O. So hydrocarbon is in fact water, hydrated carbon. It's carbon that's been hydrated. That's a hydrocarbon. But a carbohydrate is a similar thing. Carbohydrate is also hydrated carbon, and it's a green form of energy. In fact, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment in Brazil right now, and the Brazilians are world leaders, in my view, in understanding the difference between hydrocarbon and carbohydrate-based economies. Absolute world leaders in turning over sugarcane production, for example, into ethanol production, just like that, at the drop of a hat, just like that. Unlike other big industries that we know of that take long periods of time to make decisions. So what I'm learning from that is, you mentioned the resistance to investment. I think that's a key word, because you see, if you speak the language of the investor and you speak the language of water scarcity, then there's actually a mounting level of risk to any investment in a fundamentally water-constrained economy. So if that's the case, you've reached the end of the road. And therefore, the logical investment decision is to disinvest, because the risk level now starts climbing exponentially, and therefore, unless you can mitigate that risk, you can't move forward. You run out of road. So this holistic thinking, I think, is about changing that narrative and making an investor case that it's the opportunity cost of not doing something about it. And it's the investor confidence case of moving away from the doom and gloom scenario of, oh, we're fundamentally water constrained, to actually we're not constrained at all, except by our own imagination and the way we think about it. We have technology, we have capital, we have the understanding we can do it. So we've got to just craft that narrative, and the work that you and I are doing in the Middle East interests me a lot, because there we're talking to the investment cohort of people, investors that are starting to get savvy and starting to really understand that the new disruptive investor horizons are in fact about this transition from hydrocarbon to carbohydrate type of economies. So I hope that answers your question. It comes down to how do we have a package, a neat message in a way that can be understood by people and in a way that is credible. But we need thought leaders, and I look at the Holos people as kind of thought leaders. These are all people that are thinking deeply about this. Now, these are thought leaders that are going to go out and propagate these good ideas, and that's what we need. We need thought leaders in individual corporations, but ultimately it's got to be aimed at society on the one hand, because they've got to change their behavior. But on the other hand, it's got to be aimed at the investor community, and we've got to sell investors the hope. And the hope is that, hey, we're actually not constrained except by our own ingenuity.
Thank you very much. Shall we go to group 2?
Thank you, Claudius. My name is Michael, and I was from group 2. Before I ask the question, I'd just like to call out Angus has been doing some wonderful work on photographing water, and I, for one, would love to know more about that. Sunit talked about the sort of challenge of rains in India and the monsoons. Kenneth, I think, asked the question about the root cause, and he had a challenging question which we might have asked, which is why is Dr. Turton going to the Middle East rather than doing his project in Africa? That was what I think Kenneth wanted to ask. But the formulated question that we have is from, in fact, Jean, which is she has observed that women often have to walk a long way to collect the water. And I had noted from my base here in London that we face in London is the challenge of flooding from the River Thames. And the last time we built a barrier, it took about 30 years, from 1953 when the floods happened to 1980 when the Thames barrier was built. So in both questions, when there is too much water and when there is too little, our formulated question is, how can we be wiser to live with water?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I'm just thinking out loud now as you're talking. So the first thing, we use the word wiser, that immediately alerts me, and I'm very interested in that word. I pay my tribute tonight to one of my mentors, Professor Tony Allen from SOAS. I was one of his students for both my master's and my PhD degree, and I was sitting with Tony Allen in the Stockholm World Water Week one year, and there was a big debate going on about water is an economic resource. And Tony loved these new funky ideas, and he wrote down a little acronym, WIER, WEIR, water is an economic resource. And then, of course, then there was this counter argument, no, water is a social good. So water is not an economic resource. WINER, WINER. So weirs and whiners, the weirs and whiners were battling it out on this, on the stage in Stockholm. And because we were mischievous people, Tony and myself, I also started thinking, and I tried to write down a little acronym, which I slipped to him on a piece of paper. And that acronym was WISER, WISER, WISER. And I'm a synthesis person. I come from a country in conflict. I've always tried to find the middle ground. I've always tried to bring opposing parties together. This has been my life mission. And the WISER approach is to do that. WISER stands for water is both a social and an economic resource. It's neither nor, it's both. It's all of the above, okay? So water is WISER. And in fact, as the editor of the journal Water Policy, I've now got a good global view of the water problems that happen. And I can tell you with a high degree of confidence, there are only 5 problems in the world with water, only five, quite simple, quite straightforward. Every paper I ever edit got one of those 5 problems, and I'll tell you what they are. There's either too much of it, okay, it's flooding, or there's too little of it, there's drought, or it's too dirty, it's polluted, or it's too far away, or it falls at the wrong time. Those are the 5 problems of water. And those different problems have got different meanings in different geographic spaces and different social settings. So yes, it's true. Women bear an inordinate burden, particularly in traditional societies where water has to be fetched and carried. And getting back to London, I was very, very struck by the fact that London was a remarkable place for a water history. The New River Head, for example, the New River was one of the first engineered rivers that came out of early industrial revolution England. And in fact, Fleet Street and around Fleet Street, that area, some of the first wooden pipes were unearthed when they were doing some earthworks there. And this is some of the early plumbing. It couldn't take very much pressure, but nonetheless, the hydraulic history of London is an incredibly sophisticated and interesting hydraulic history. So bottom line is that yes, we've got to think on the one hand about the complexity of water, but we've got to reduce that complexity down to simple things that we can understand. And in fact, my standard answer to this is that water is actually a dilemma. And we as professionals have to understand that a dilemma is something for which all alternatives are equally unappealing. So our role as professionals is to convert a dilemma into a series of problems, because a problem by definition is soluble. So if we understand those 5 problems, what we learn from that now is there is no silver bullet. Beware the carpet bag salesman that comes with a silver bullet solution. It just requires a bit of magic medicine that you put in some water and something magic is going to happen. Beware of that person, okay? There is no silver bullet. It's a highly nuanced, it's a highly textured thing. But ultimately, the 5 problems: too much, too little, too dirty, too far, wrong time. That's what we've got to solve. We've got to figure it out. And it's actually not difficult because the dilemma becomes the problem, and problems are by definition soluble.
Great. Okay, group.
I want to add something. One thing. The 6th problem is the wrong form. We had a huge hail event yesterday in Austria, and it destroyed a lot of crops. So hail or snow. So the form is also a problem.
Well, that's to do with the distribution. So the physics of the planet are all about the distribution. Because water is a constant flux, it moves in time and space constantly. The same volume of water we have on the planet today is what we had when the dinosaurs roamed free, which is no different to what happened, in previous ice ages, etc. So the volume of water as a single stock is relatively constant. But the way it is distributed around the planet, this, of course, is the big challenge. Also, of the total volume of water on the planet, only about 2% is fresh water. And of that 2%, more than half of it is tied up in ice packs, etc., etc. So we as human beings are dependent on a very, very small fraction of a very large volume. But the fraction is always going to be scarce. But if we understand it as a perpetual flow, it's almost like the renewable energy debate. It's also about understanding energy as a constant flow. There's a constant flow and movement. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. So ultimately, if we understand the flow of things, then we can start getting into more meaningful answers. So of course, if you start heating up the planet, then you're going to start fundamentally altering the distribution of this vapor around the planet, and you're going to change the energy levels of your rainfall events, and you're going to get thunder and lightning and hailstones and all kinds of destruction. So this is part of the elementary physics of the planet. But I mean, it's unless we can understand that as a species, and this I think is a challenge. We are living in times as a species where our future as a species on this planet is dependent on our ability to reach consensual decisions about highly complex and emotive subjects taking place at a time where everyone has an opinion about anything without any knowledge about those things, that's amplified by social media. That's our challenge. That's our challenge. So yeah, it's a complicated thing. On the other hand, it's simple, it's very simple and beautiful.
Thank you. We're running tight on time, so let's go straight to group 3.
Thank you, Claudius. I'll speak for group 3. I'll try and synthesize the different questions, so forgive me if I don't get this quite right, group 3. The question that I've put together from the questions that we were speaking about is this. If our duty is to manage water across time and space as a flow, and as both a material and spiritual good, can you give good examples of good management practice that could inspire us in the future so that a global trade of water could give back to nature as a resource for the future?
Okay, that's a tough question. So very, very congratulations to Group 3. They've got me in a bit of a half Nelson stranglehold there.
Yay, Group 3.
No, but the battle's not over yet. The battle's not over yet. I'll come out of my corner fighting now. I gave a talk a while ago in Australia, and I was struck by the one important question. It's up in a place called the Burdekin River, up in the northern part of Australia, the northeastern part of Australia. And what struck me about the Aboriginal people was the notion of how much is enough. So how much is a flow? Claudius was talking about the flow of water in the spring outside his house. That's enough for him to survive, but that's not enough for a beer brewing company to survive on. So the question, the philosophical question, how much is enough? That answers that question of how do we manage water as a flow. And in reality, I'll give you an example of our inability to do it. You're all familiar with the fact that South Africa had this very serious problem in 2018 in Cape Town when the Cape Town city ran out of water, and they declared a thing called Day Zero. And in the panic, much like the coronavirus panic today, politicians didn't understand how to manage it, so they did the best that they could, and they started calling for all kinds of restrictions on tourism. Now, the economy of that area is driven to a large extent by tourists. And if you start shrinking down the flow of tourists, then you start destroying the cash flow basis of the area, and you start destroying livelihoods by the millions. And one of the things that they were giving out now in hotels was a little rubber duck. So instead of getting when you check into your hotel, you would get a little rubber duck, and you would go and find that in your hotel room there was no plug for the bath, so you were not able to bath. And they were encouraging people who were spending good dollars and good euros here not to spend their good dollars and euros and to have an unpleasant and unhappy experience. Now, that's the wrong thinking, because every drop of water that is ever used in a bath can quite easily be recycled again. So those hotels, all they need to start thinking about now is turning one of the parking bays in their parking garage down at the basement of the building into a holding tank and start catching the water. Instead of putting it in the sewer, does it make sense to put all of our water down the same sewer, to go to the same wastewater treatment works, when it's all of a different quality and a different type? And it's quite easy to recapture and recycle that water and water your gardens in the hotel, or create all kinds of other livelihoods from it. So the Swedes right now, they're thinking now in very, very interesting ways about the recovery of urine from toilets, for example, where they're separating urine at source. And they're now creating a circular economy around various products that are found in human urine. So they're converting a problem into a solution, which requires a replumbing of the system, but it's okay because we're now evolving and developing into a better place. So I'm afraid there are not any really good examples of how it is being done. There's some examples of green shoots of thinking about how it could be done. And one of them, of course, is led by none other than the beer industry. The beer industry is a massive user of water, and they've created this notion of water footprinting. And from water footprinting, you see that to produce 1 liter of beer in Bavaria, takes about 120 something liters of water, but to produce the same liter of beer in South Africa is about 250 liters of water. So the idea of water footprinting and the awareness that comes around that is starting to change behavior. But ultimately, we're all going to have to start recycling at different levels. And here the economies of scale kick in. Here it becomes an engineering problem. It becomes an economic problem. It's a complex problem in its own right, because to manage water at that level of scale, smelly, dirty water with biologically degradable components to it it's an unpleasant task, but nonetheless it's technically possible. So that's where the business opportunity lies, in finding those eloquent solutions. I hope I've done justice to your very complex question, and if not, I'll gladly take it up offline.
Thank you, Tony. I just want to do a process check. We said that we would go until the half hour. We're just about there. Are you able to spend a little bit more time with us, Tony?
Yes, by all means. I'm yours until you say I can go.
Thank you very much. For those of us that have other issues, we won't take it amiss if you need to go. But thank you very much, Tony, that you will stay with us. And so maybe group 4, your question.
I think group 4 was us, but I don't exactly remember which group we have been. Anthony, thanks for your speech. One question that we discussed quite heavily was what did you mean by business models, and how do we adapt? And that's something that I would like to add is, how do we adapt those things that you just mentioned? Yeah. Taking urine into water, collecting rainwater and so on. How do we integrate that into our personal day-by-day life? Because I think there's something, beer companies, big companies that have that as part on their agenda, but what can we do as individuals to take more care for water?
Okay, that's a great question. How do we change business models? I think my understanding of economics is that it's the science of scarcity and it's the science of opportunity, and it's the way the way that we as technical people can repackage problems and convert them into opportunities. That's what matters. I told you early on that as a young boy I was deeply moved by the Apollo program. How to get a man on the moon safely and bring him back again within the lifetime of my lifetime. And of course, if you look very carefully, one of the fundamental problems that the NASA program had was, in order to keep human beings alive in outer space, you had to take a certain volume of water with them. And of course, that volume of water is very heavy. So it became ultimately an engineering problem of the amount of fuel needed to lift a huge mass off the planet Earth into orbit, and then to bring it back again. And of course, they solved that problem by recycling water. So they didn't have a lot of water on the space capsule, and they captured all of the water vapor that they were breathing. They captured all of their urine, all of their sweat, all of that stuff, and they just simply recycle it. And that's where your reverse osmosis technology that you get today in your under kitchen counter systems that you buy from Amazon or from China, that all comes from the NASA space program. So there you have an example of a problem that was understood by engineers that eventually spun out into a new series of solutions. So I think that's what the trick is. We need a behavior change on the one hand, but that behavior change also needs to understand the limitations of what the individual can do. It's always a question of scale whenever you deal with water. And when I'm talking about scale, I'm not talking about industrial scale now. I'm talking about going from small to big, going from simple to complex. That level of scale. And this, I guess, is part of the holism or holistic thinking about it, okay? The closer you get to the level of the individual, the more willing you might find the individual to change, but the more difficult it is to actually find solutions with which they can apply or to that change. So there's a sort of level of optimization that we've got to find. And I think the work we're doing in the Middle East now is going to be looking at those kind of different solutions for different problems at different levels of scale. and how to solve the NASA problem now of taking a large heavy load to the moon and back, when you can just recycle what's being carried in the atmosphere that you're taking with you anyhow. So the idea now is how to convert a dilemma into a series of problems, and then how to convert those problems into opportunities that are capable of funding, of attracting capital. Good ideas always flow to, capital always flows to good ideas that are sold by enthusiastic and competent people. So we've got to start developing that platform where we can get enthusiastic and competent people that generate these good ideas, and then marry them up with people with deep pockets that are willing to invest in the new frontiers. So we're going, as I said earlier on, I didn't maybe make the case strong enough. When we've transitioned through a geological epoch, as we have done now, we've gone from the Holocene to the Anthropocene in 1945, let's call it that. A specific defined period of time, as now defined in the rocks and the sediment of the rivers. All other geological epoch transitions in the history of the planet have been violent, cataclysmic, and generally quite slow. So they've been events that have taken place over a period of time, but they've always been very disruptive, violent, extremely violent. We have been through a rapid transition of a type of violence that we're still experiencing in a very short period of time, but a fundamental transition. And I believe that fundamental transition is going to give us a binary outcome as a species. And that binary outcome as a species is we're either going to adapt or we are going to become redundant. Those are the kind of the two bleak opposites that we have. So in that process of adaptation, I believe this is where we are now uniquely placed to start developing these really, really important ideas, whereby we can on the one hand sell hope and sell a new vision and a new dream, that it's not doom and gloom, that we can get out of this mess that we've created, and on the other hand, just fundamentally rethink our own position as a species vis-a-vis other species, and our own position within a greater hierarchy. Remember I said earlier on that my relevance is part of being of a greater whole. How do we understand each of us as a part of that greater whole, and how do we interact with that greater whole in a way that we can influence that greater whole, because we do, but influence it for good, influence in a positive way. And then how do we ultimately create consensus? This is the big challenge. Getting consensus amongst people that are too lazy to think, unwilling to think, uncomfortable to think about abstract ideas, not even willing to read anything longer than 127 characters in a tweet, etc. This is a challenge that we have in our lifetime. How do we get complex ideas across to a general level of consensus? And how do we destigmatize intellectualism? How do we destigmatize the sciences? Because the sciences and intellectuals are increasingly becoming a scarce species, and in many cases they are targeted. So these are some of the challenges that we have. How do we make science funky again? And how do we encourage critical thinking, really, really critical thinking, and out of the box challenging thinking?
Great, thank you so much. So now I'm not going to go through the numbers. You'll know those who still have a question to pose. Please just hit in the reactions at the bottom of your page. You'll see reactions. Hit that when you're ready to pose your question to Dr. Turton.
I'm ready.
Go for it, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. In honor of group number 5, Dr. Turton, I'm going to tap into, pun intended, tap into your storyteller, story sharer skills. And here's the question. What are 2 holistic ways to address the consumption of water if water was to share 2 book titles with children today?
Oh, okay, now you're really throwing a curveball at me.
So okay. What we're asking water to be present as a holist in this meeting, and you get to share the 2 book titles on their behalf.
So you're asking me to actually come up with book titles?
Yeah, or just a key idea that could be framed up. I'm not asking.
Yeah, okay. I think
what are the 2 parts?
Okay, I think the important red flag that you've tossed my way in the way you framed the question is the consumption of water. You see, our key problem is we are a consumer society, and everything has been commodified. And while I talk about business models and attracting investors, of course we have to do those things, but we can't commodify everything. Getting back to the whys of story, water is both a social and an economic good. It's not just a commodity. There are spiritual and social values to water as well. So I think that one of the big challenges for kid book title is consumption. Are there limits to consumption? I mean, we know that there are limits to consumption. This has been written about by clever people for a long period of time. So how do we start unpacking the notion of consumption, and how do we start replacing that with the notion of custodianship, the custodial or stewardship role? How do we create a new generation of young people that are going to go on to become citizens, voting citizens, active members of the economy, willing to put a stewardship hat on things, willing to be custodians of something from which they benefit, but over which they have very little direct control. And so those are the two things, I think: consumption and stewardship, challenging the question of consumption. And one of the nicest stories I've ever read was a Dr. Seuss book, and I know that he's controversial of late. But the one Dr. Seuss about who's this fellow with a big moustache who was responsible for the trees. No one was speaking for the trees. That Dr. Seuss book, I can't think of the name of it now, but
the Lorax.
Sorry, the Lorax, that's the one. Okay, that kind of storytelling to me was gripping, because the Lorax story told the story the way anyone could understand it, and it was so profoundly true. Okay, so that's the kind of storytelling that I think we should think about. But I think that it is very, very important, and I'll just give you an answer by means of a story. When I was a small boy, my father was a big fisherman, and he took me to a place between the Ngoos, the Nguzi, and the Ngango rivers. Now, we won't say that name easily, but these are three rivers that come together at a place called the Wild Coast. And this is a wild place, believe me. And these three rivers come together, and at the estuary, the mouth of these rivers, there's just wonderful fishing. And my father was pulling in the fish, and he taught me how to catch fish, and I caught my very, very first fish as a small boy, and I was very proud and very happy, and my dad made a big fuss over me for catching my first fish. Many years later, I took my son back to the same place, and I was sort of remembering my story of my dad about catching my big fish at that very same place. And in this case, we went out on the estuary in a boat, and we were fishing out of a boat, and I taught my son how to pump for mud prawns out of the mud banks and put these mud prawns on the hook. And he caught himself what we call a grunter. I don't know what you'd call a grunter there, but it's a fish that lives in estuaries, and it eats these shrimps. And I was very proud of my son. And to my very great surprise, he gently pulled the fish in, and then he removed the hook from the mouth, and he let the fish go. And this was a culture shock to me, because when I caught my first fish, you had to take it back to camp, and you had to proudly display it, and everyone had to have a little bite of it, and you had to cook it and eat it. Okay. And now here was my little son, my small little kid that I was teaching what my father taught me. And now he's defying all of this conventional wisdom and letting the fish go again. And I almost chastised him. I said, what are you doing? You've gone through all the effort to catch fish. And he looked at me with an enormous wisdom in his eyes. And he said, Dad, I've had so much pleasure catching this fish now. I'm releasing it so that one day I can have the same pleasure when that fish gets bigger. And the lesson that I learned from that was the wisdom of the youth. We must never, ever underestimate how wise young people are. So the wisdom of the youth, by tapping into their energy stream and helping them to rethink things, okay, and giving them a voice. This whole idea of books for children, I think, is a fantastic one. And the idea of challenging the nakedness of consumption, which is about take, make, and throw away. Take away and extract and get rid of your waste at the lowest possible cost, okay? The greatest possible profit. That is unsustainable. We have to do that in a different way, the circular economy approach, where the waste of one becomes the input of another. This is how ecosystems function, okay? And this is, we've got to go to the new industrial ecosystem where the waste from one output becomes a fuel for another. And then I think we're starting to talk sense. But one more final thing I'd like to say. When dealing with any of these things, the lesson that I've learned is that I can very rapidly depress people, and I hope not to depress people, because I try to be a voice of inspiration and a voice of hope. So when packaging these stories, it's terribly important that we don't depress people by the enormity and the ugliness of our reality. We have to always give people hope. And here I will just make a closing statement by just telling a short story about another one of my mentors. At one point in my professional life, I found myself being appointed by Mikhail Gorbachev as a chairman of one of his working groups. Gorbachev became interested in water, believe it or not, and he was interested in water as a sovereignty issue. And he appointed myself and Dr. Barbara Heinzen from the United States of America as chairman of two of these subcommittees. And I was responsible for Africa, and Barbara was responsible for the Middle East, North Africa. And in that process, I met one of Gorbachev's advisors, and his name was a Rabbi Aviram Suttendorp. And we were having coffee at Starbucks in Kyoto, and we were talking to each other. And I said to him, Rabbi, I'm very interested in names. As an African, I'm always interested in names, and because I always put a name to a place where people come from and their accents, etc. And I said, your name, Suttendorp, is not a Jewish name, but you are, as a rabbi, you clearly are a Jew. And he said to me, yes, a very astute observation, he said. And he said, yes, my name is Suttendorp because during the Holocaust, my parents were taken away, and some good person put me in a suitcase on the front doorstep of the Suttendorp family in Amsterdam. And the Suttendorps brought me up as one of theirs. But the Suttendorps taught me an important lesson to never, ever forget that I'm actually a Jew. So this is an important lesson that he learned. And but then he said to me something very profound, and that's the closing statement I'm going to make. He said to me that he had learned that a person can live for weeks without food, for days without water, but not for a moment without hope. So the issue of hope is the most critical commodity that's in the scarcest of supply in our modern world today. How do we have vision of a better future for people that gives them hope rather than drives them into the depths of despair? So that I would put out to you, Stephen, as your one of your challenges for your book writing group, to fill these young children with hope for a better future and the belief that they have the ability, they themselves, because unfortunately the parents' generation has probably let them down.
Thank you on behalf of group number 5.
Thank you so much. The next question, just put up your hand. Okay, any open question? There we go, Alec.
So I had a question. Tony, you used the term holism. Is that similar or different than things like systems thinking and those ideas?
Look, I'm not in any way an expert on holism. The little bit of holism that I've dabbled in was the work by Jan Smuts, a famous South African who some of you might well be familiar with. So I'm not really an expert on holism. Systems thinking, I think, is really a way of trying to stay within the parameters of reductionist physics, but put your toe outside to feel how cold it is outside. So, when you start talking about system, well, what is the outer limit of the system? How do you define the system? And I know from a water perspective, one of the things that became a very, very serious problem was in the 1980s, there was a growing international consensus with the World Summit on Sustainable Development, etc. The notion of integrated water resource management popped up, IWRM. And integrated water resource management had a couple of key principles, and one of them was the management of water in the river basin. So the catchment as the unit of management, the unit of analysis, the unit of management. But immediately that started running into problems because on the one hand, you've got groundwater that's underneath the ground, and that might not obey the same catchment boundaries as surface water does. So there's already a blurring of the boundaries. And of course, the second thing now is when you are moving water like the Spanish do and like the South Africans do, the Indians do, they move water from one river basin to another in massive interbasin transfer schemes. Effectively, every river gets linked to every other river, and you can't define the outer limits of the system. So from that, I learned that systems thinking is kind of like a con job to try and expand your unit of analysis, but it doesn't really go far enough. It doesn't really go to understand that there are actually limits to, well, there are limits to the way we think about it, but there's also an infinite sort of frontier out there where all kinds of disciplines become merged, where there is no more a disciplinary boundary between chemistry and physics, or between spirituality and nature, etc. These things all become blurred. So that's my understanding of it. I just think that I've learned how to think about these things, and I've learned how to think more and speak less. Although I've spoken a lot tonight, but I've learned how to try to ask questions about these things. And I don't know if that's answered your question, but I hope so.
That's pretty amazing, actually, because I'm thinking of the city of Chicago. On their flag has, that the river, they connected the Great Lakes Basin to the Mississippi Basin. And that's, a great engineering marvel. But to your point, you've just connected something together and created all kinds of immense problems. So I appreciate what you're saying, that systems thinking only takes you so far.
Well, I happen to be a student in West Chicago, 1976, 77, believe it or not. So at the time of Mayor Daley, when Mayor Daley was dyeing the river green every St. Patrick's Day. Now, and of course, coming out of the Great Lakes, you've now got the problem there of those zebra mussels. So these are mussels that have come out of ballast tanks that have fundamentally altered the ecology of the Great Lakes system, which is one of the largest single freshwater bodies in the world. I mean, it's an amazing place. Okay, so I'm familiar with that part of the world, and I learned a lot of stuff at the Fermi Lab, amongst other things. And when people were colliding particles in accelerators, and I became fascinated by that as well. But nonetheless, I love Chicago. It's a great part of the world.
Alec, stay connected with us with the Holos project, and that is a topic that is really intriguing to us, the shift from systems theory through to complexity theory, the science of complexity emergence, systemic, cybernetics, informatics, to holism. So
I love it, because I've been talking to Josh Colchester of Systems Innovation and Sean and Daniel of Complexity Weekend. So I love that you guys have this whole thing with water and all the stuff you're doing, because it totally ties into that, because it keeps running into these limits where it's like, they're like just arbitrarily draw a boundary somewhere, and it's so arbitrary. And I love what you said there, Tony, because it makes so much sense.
Right. Okay, we're running tight on time now. We've been pushing into Dr. Turton's birthday. Any more questions before we do a final wrap up here? Okay.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Hello. I had to arrive late because I was in fact giving a talk to a cybernetics community. It's Angus speaking. But I've really enjoyed what you've been talking about. And I'd like to ask you, from the point of view that you just were giving about this deep down whole picture of the world, if you go really deeply into this subject that you truly love, water, what deep down is water for you?
Yeah, that's once again a great question, and I can't give you a single answer. To me, water is so many things, and the more I've dabbled in the water, the way I describe water is like falling in love with an exceedingly beautiful woman, and the more infatuated you are, the more complex you realize that this beautiful woman is. Okay, and it's got all kinds of different moods and different aspects and different facets to it. Water is different things to different people at different times and different places. And one of the things that struck me is that the great civilizations of the world have all risen on some kind of hydraulic foundation. And in fact, in in my dabblings of the world, I learned a very important lesson from the Chinese, which I'll share with you now. The Chinese have got a symbol for a river, which looks something like a river, looks like 5 fingers of a hand, and looks like the flow of a river into the from tributaries into the main stem. And they've got another symbol. It's a square symbol with 2 little horns on the top of it, and that means a dike. So a dike is clearly engineered, and it's got these 2 little levees on the side, and that's what a dike is. And on the other hand, you've got this the symbol of the river. But if you put those 2 words together, I'm told, this means political order, social order. So it takes on a whole new meaning. So society has arisen over time, in part by the way that they've controlled the flow of water into civilized areas, and of course, ultimately the flow of waste out of those areas. There's a whole story about what the Romans did, etc., etc. But basically, it came down to the civilizations have risen on the flow of water, and civilizations have also failed on, not because water has stopped flowing, and now it gets interesting. Civilizations have failed, ancient hydraulic civilizations have failed not because of the shortage of water, but because of the abundance of salt, the buildup of salt in salinized irrigation fields. So this is an important thing, okay, about salt. It's the relationship of water and salt. So for me, what water captures is almost the most, I don't want to use the word primordial, but the most fundamental of things, hydrogen and oxygen that comes together, forms this little Mickey Mouse sort of shaped thing, little mouse shape with 2 ears. And what's interesting is the point of attachment between hydrogen and oxygen isn't exactly perfect. There's an angle of attachment plus or minus a few percent of deviation. And my understanding is that is why the Inuit Indians have got, I don't know how many hundreds of words for snow, because all snowflakes are different, because those little things of attachment are slightly different. So no two molecules are actually identical. Now that's quite profound. If you look at the flow of a river and say, well, there's a river. But if you then go down to another level and say, well, actually no two atoms of water or no 2 molecules of water are exactly the same. And the way that they link up forms different snowflakes, and that gets in the whole idea of happy water and sad water and pictures of water and all this kind of stuff, Now we get into another realm now, where if I spoke about that in my professional life, people would think that I'm crazy, and they wouldn't do business with me, okay? But these are aspects of it. So there are things that we don't understand, and to me, it's the beauty, that simplistic beauty that also embraces that enormous complexity in that one simple thing. It's almost like you're looking at the essence of life, and you're trying to sort of wonder at that simple H2O, what it means. When H2O is linked up to carbon, does it become a carbohydrate or does it become a hydrocarbon? And each of those have got completely different pathways that go from there now. So it's been a fascinating journey, a deep dive journey of exploration and trying to figure out what's going on between hydrogen, oxygen, and human beings.
Dr. Turton, I think that probably puts it into a wonderful space. That question of Angus puts it into a wonderful poetic space. And my sense now is that we might have a reconvening of this on another occasion where we look at the spiritual implications of water. I had an opportunity to spend 2 hours in conversation with Masaru Emoto, the controversial fellow that did quick freezing of water molecules, water crystals, and showing that even our thoughts affect the water. That's a whole new dimension that we might take a look at. But I want to thank you so much for giving your time on your birthday. I want to hope that there's no effects from having taken your shot today for COVID. I want to thank you for your particular emphasis on the idea that we are significant and relevant when we are part of the whole, when we realize that. It's that collaboration with nature. I think it's really important that you've identified, we've created a geological age, and we've got to change our thinking. The resources are there, we've got to change our thinking. And that is the intention of the Holos project. Is just as Alex asked the question, what is holism? To actually get that shift in our consciousness and to really engage, to do battle with that in a joyful way so that we can change our practice. So thank you so much for all the participants, for your time, and to Nick for having managed our technology, and Joshua that has been our host today. And we will keep you posted. We'll have a recording of this session. So anybody would like a recording of this session, you can just ask for it. You can email me and we'll send you the recording. I'm going to pop my email address into the chat box right now.
And we'll also put the edited recording on the website, Claudius.
And we'll put the recording on the website. So
can you please send me a link to that website, and then I'll put it out in my network as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so thank you so much, and looking forward to our future engagement. And once again, Anthony, all the best with your birthday, and may you have a wonderful year ahead with your mind as well.
Happy birthday, Anthony.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, many happy returns.
Yes.
Thank you.